you are not registered and not joining us on Zoom, can do your best, or we'll do our best to try and find your questions out there in the comments section on YouTube Live, or perhaps we might have somebody out there who is monitoring Twitter for us as well. But don't be shy, toss your questions out. We'll do as best we can to answer them, but let me introduce the panel who's going to be answering those questions for you. First up, we have Aubrey Sambor, our senior front-end developer. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Aubrey.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so as Chris said, I'm a senior front-end developer at Lullabot. I've been at Lullabot for 2.5 years, and I'm in the process of studying for the CPACC exam so I can become accessibility certified. I first learned about web accessibility in 2004 after reading Mark Pilgrim's Dive into Accessibility. And I became really interested after my father became a quadriplegic and I watched him try to use the computer without the ability to use his hands. So it was interesting trying to get in there to help a lot of other people who can't, type or have to use like voice to text software. So yeah, great. Looking forward to answering some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Aubrey. Kat Shaw, senior front-end developer here at Lullabot. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Kat.
Hi, I'm Kat Shaw. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Wanted to make sure. Hi, I'm Kat Shaw. I am a senior front-end developer as well. I've been here as long as Aubrey. We started, I think, the same day or around the same time. So I've been at Lullabot for almost 3 years, 2.5 years, be 3 years in September. I been doing web development. Let's see, I have a 25-year-old son, almost 25. So I've been doing web development for almost as long as he's been born, alive. So about 23, almost 24 years. I got into accessibility specifically because I saw a wonderful talk by a man in a Kansas City users group. And it was on accessibility. He was a blind user that worked at the GSA, and he basically demoed a screen reader and showed us issues with websites and how to fix them. And I went right back to my job where I worked at the time was Douglas County, Kansas, as a web developer, and went and just fixed small issues and kind of just went from there and just never looked back. So I also became CPACC certified several years ago, and hoping to get my trusted tester certification at some point with the government. Oh, and I live in Perry, Kansas. That's about it.
All right, thanks, Kat. Pauline Judge, front-end developer and one of our newest Lullabots to join the team. Thanks for being here today, Pauline. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Pauline Judge. I'm a front-end developer and I'm relatively new to Lullabot, about 6 months. But my previous position, I worked doing front-end development for a lot of .gov sites. So they have really high standards and requirements for accessibility, and that's how I got into accessibility originally, and it's just kind of traveled with me ever since then.
Excellent. All right. Well, we are definitely prepared to handle any questions you can throw at us. So as a reminder, here in Zoom, we have the Q&A feature you'll see at the bottom of your screen, or you can access through the bottom of your screen. So type any questions you've got in about anything related to accessibility at all, and we'll try and stump the experts today and see what we can do. So while we're getting a few of those queued up in your minds, maybe a few topics to get the juices flowing here. So a lot of us were actually at DrupalCon a few weeks ago, the first in-person DrupalCon in years. And if you survived COVID, then you're probably very excited that you were at DrupalCon. For most of us, maybe not the best idea, but we're here, everybody's doing great. And we learned a lot about what's coming up in Drupal. So I'd like to ask that question. What, with a lot of these new themes and modules and looking forward to Drupal 10, what sort of things should we expect to see on the accessibility front coming up in Drupal that's helping to position Drupal in a better light and a better frame when it comes to accessibility? Anyone want to take a jump at that one to start us off?
I could take a jump at it. First of all, I am a COVID survivor from DrupalCon, along with a lot of other people. That wasn't great. I know I'm not alone. So the first thing a lot of people heard about, I'm sure, which is awesome news, was that Olivero and Claro became default themes in Drupal. So for Drupal 9 and 10, and the future. They both offer great accessibility, and they were built with accessibility in mind from the beginning, which is wonderful. I have been fortunate enough to work with the teams on both of those projects, with Mike Herschel and Christina Cumulas. I hope I pronounced that right. And all of the other developers, Laurie and Gabor and a bunch of other people. It's really important that those were built with accessibility in mind from the beginning, because when you start with the very beginning process of the design and planning all the way through to the development and everything else with the accessibility, as opposed to wait until the end of your work, it's a lot easier and it makes a lot more sense. If you'd like, I could probably demo. Yep, I think I could demo it. So would you like me to demo them?
Yeah, let's
Maybe?
bring it up for a minute here. Well, like while we're waiting for some questions to come through the Q&A, let's see what we have in core.
Okay, so this is just something I just put up on with Umami. So I'll just log in. Live demo. I didn't test this out. Okay, so far so good. So if I go to appearance, and let's see. First off, I'll just change this right down here. First, I gotta install Claro.
While you're going through and setting that up, what
Mhm.
is in your opinion, the biggest accessibility benefit or the most important accessibility feature that we put into, or I say we, I didn't really take part in this, but you all have put into these themes? If you had to pick one out of all of the new features that went in there, what's the most important?
I'd say the focus handling. Focus handling when it comes to visibility of focus. When it comes to, so that means when you tab through with the keyboard and you're able to see the outline of whatever you're tabbing to, how it looks. So it's not just like very small, but it's very noticeable. Being able to tab to items, those kinds of things are very important, and both of them made them very important features of their themes. Also, keyboard navigation is another one, especially with Olivero with its keyboard. It was a very important thing that they focused on. So that would be another thing that I really like a lot. So here's Claro, and you could see it's a lot more beautiful than 7. And it's got some great features. These are the alerts. I'm not going to go way too far into it, but you can see as I'm tabbing through, you can see what I'm talking about with the focus visibility. It's much easier to see with where you're at on the page, which is just awesome. Claro, or Olivero, I'm sorry, is right here. So I'll just install and set that as the default, and there you go.
So for anyone who's not familiar, Olivero would be the default public-facing theme for Drupal, and then Claro would be the default administrative theme.
Exactly. And again, you can see exactly where you're at on the page, and it's just beautiful. It's a beautiful theme. It's clean. It's a big step forward from Bartik, which has been the default theme for Drupal for a long time. So when you're demoing it for your stakeholders, you got this. So that's pretty much it. So I'll stop sharing.
So we mentioned that those are in core now. Are those ready to use? Is there anything that would stop somebody from setting up their Drupal site using Olivero and Claro?
No.
So got the latest version of Drupal, go ahead, turn them on, use them, check them out, and you'll instantly get that accessibility boost on your site from those.
Absolutely. You'll definitely get it. And if you do have any issues that you find, because nothing is 100% accessible, report those issues to the issue. Remember, they're in core now, so report those to the issue queue in core, and just make sure that they're marked for Claro or Olivero.
Excellent. And I see I'm following along with the chats and the questions here. So Andy Bloom just pointed out in 9.4 they are available, and then by the first version of Drupal 10 they will be on by default, and that's really exciting. There we go.
Awesome.
If I can count on Andy for anything, it's about being pedantic. Thanks, Andy. All right, so we have those themes coming in. While we're on the topic of Drupal, before we shift off of that, are there any other additional modules that people should be looking at to enhance the accessibility on their site that come to mind?
Yeah, I can name some. There's several features that are built into core that are great. And then there's also contributed modules. So I did write an article, it's called How Cool Accessibility Tools Can Make Your Life Easier. So if you go to Lullabot, you'll be able to find that under me on there. So some contributed modules specifically, there's one called Block ARIA Landmark Roles, which adds ARIA landmark roles and other labels to your blocks. There's another one called Block Class, which can add CSS classes to your blocks. And so that helps because it allows you to avoid inline CSS. There is a CK editor accessibility checker, but that's currently for Drupal 8. I don't think they have a Drupal 9, and I know that with CK editor going to 5, it's not ready for 5, I don't think. There's also, Path Auto to make your URLs more user-friendly. And there's also one called Style Guide, which is great for developers because if you install that, you can then go to your theme, get a full style guide, and you can do accessibility checks on your entire style guide, your entire theme. Wow. And that's really cool. And when it comes to core modules, RL alerts are great. That's it's used by screen reader users, a JavaScript method for providing announcements orally to creating the ARIA, by creating the ARIA live element on the page. So that means like if you do a search that allows them to know that what the search results are on a page would be an example. Inline form errors, so the errors are with the form field. Responsive images, so like a mobile user will get small images and a desktop will get the larger one. The text editor requires alt text for images, and views can allow you to update links to make them more friendly by adding like an ARIA label to a read more link, for instance, to add an accessible link with giving it purpose.
Oh yeah.
So there's lots of things in Drupal alone. Just by
excellent. And it's like somebody has dropped a link for us in the comment. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Looks like this went out to everybody for the articles on the lullabot.com website, accessibility tools to make your life easier. So there's a link there in the chat, and we'll include those with the notes at the end. I'm sure we'll have those somewhere. Or just go ahead and search on lullabot.com for accessibility, and we'll have lots of resources there for you. So it sounds like there's lots of options to help fix those, or to help enhance your website through the themes, through the modules, if you're using Drupal. But we do actually have a question here from Javier. He wants to know, and this kind of ties into some of the ARIA roles you were talking about there, Kat, but I'd like to open this up to everybody. What are some of the most frequent errors, in your opinion, when trying to make an accessible website? For instance, using too many ARIA attributes instead of semantic HTML. So does anyone want to take a stab at that one? What do we see most commonly in accessibility, or websites that are missing the mark on accessibility?
One thing I see a lot of is contrast errors. I think that's the biggest one I see by far, is insufficient contrast. So that's definitely one to look out for when you're developing a site. Just testing and making sure that your text is readable on whatever background, or if it's on a button. Just making sure that is something that is readable. Also, alt text. I feel like some sites are getting better with this, but there's still a long way to go with actually adding alt text to your images. So that's another one I see a lot of. Yeah.
Pauline, what have you noticed that has been kind of the gotcha that everybody misses?
I was going to say exactly what Aubrey said, honestly. those are definitely the two most common that I've come across as well. I think that the awareness around color contrast is increasing in the development community. I think people are becoming, and content communities, I think people are becoming more aware of it now, and same with alt text, but it's definitely still a struggle. And especially for sites that have complicated images or imagery that might have a lot of information in it. Like a lot of the clients that I used to work for had lots of scientific graphs, images of graphs, and it was content that they had to have. So getting around stuff like that can be tricky. If you can avoid complicated images, that's better. But otherwise, yeah, alt text or just long descriptions of things is where you have to go.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because I've worked on sites as well that have like not data visualization in an interactive form, but in a static form, like in a GIF.
Mm-hmm.
What's the appropriate way to handle that, to make something like that, a graph or a chart that is in a static form, to make that accessible if you can't embed a dynamic, call it a widget or piece of functionality into the website?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. But Kat might know, Kat or Aubrey might know a better way. What we used to do was actually link off to the written version of it, because when you have an image that is so complicated and you have a really long description of it, you can't fit all of that text into an alt text attribute. So when I first started learning about accessibility, I learned about the long description attribute, but I don't think anyone ever uses it. I haven't come across it in practice. And so I'm not sure how valid it is anymore. That was a few years ago when I learned about it. But yeah, the way we used to handle it in my previous job was to actually just link off to a different page that had like a long description, a different page, or kind of like a footnote at the bottom of the page. But it's tricky. Does anyone else have a?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think, if you have a very, very simple thing, a long description would be fine. But if you have a really complicated chart, definitely a table, an accessible table is the way to go. I did like something years ago where I did a table that when using CSS, it actually turned into a chart. So that was kind of cool. So I think that would be the best way to do it, honestly. But yeah, if you just have it connected to an accessible table of data, that would be the best way. One thing with the alt text is not only adding alt text, that's obviously important, but making sure it's a meaningful alt text. So not just having like a picture that has a bunch of stuff and just saying flowers. Make sure that it has meaningful alt text, like girl running in a field of flowers or something, so that the blind user, is able to know exactly what's going on in the picture and it's meaningful to them. One thing that Javier mentioned, which is totally true, is using semantic native HTML by default and using ARIA only when necessary. It's like it's the first rule of ARIA is don't use it unless you have to. So, people, and I've done this when I first worked with ARIA, just using it everywhere. It's like, oh, I'm not supposed to do that. So make sure you know that. Another thing I see a lot is, especially on main menus, is keyboard accessibility. Using a tab key and not being able to get through, like especially a mega menu. So if you go to your site and you just tab through your whole site, if you're not able to use the keyboard tab and arrows to get to your mega menu or your sub nav, then that's not accessible, and that's a big issue. The final one would be forms, and forms is the number one issue. I believe it's the number one issue for like a 508 complaints. Make sure your forms are accessible. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, making sure you have a label for all of your like inputs or text areas. I think that's a big one, because a lot of people actually click on the label to select the checkbox or do things like that. And if you don't have that label correctly implemented, then it's going to be a lot harder for people to actually know that this label is for this item. So that's another one I see on occasion as well, especially when I'm navigating the internet and I come across it. I get so mad. I'm like, come on, just link this label to this element, please. So
yes, I do the same thing. And I think we answered somebody's question through the conversation we just had there, because they were asking about how do you write good alt text. And I think what I remember when I was back in my developer days was just kind of like you're saying, using the voiceover tool or if I were to think about it like I can't see the image, imagine like the SRC value, the source value of the image is broken and it puts the alt text there in place of that image. If I was just reading through that sentence, what would make sense to me? So take a real world approach to it. If you can't actually see the image, what text would replace that image to make the conversation, make the context continue to flow? And I'm going to keep branching down this chain a little bit. We have talked, or we said the word ARIA a number of times, and that stands for, and I'm going to borrow this because I put it into the chat. I didn't know what it stood for, but you all have pointed it out for me. Accessible Rich Internet Applications. So for someone who might not know what an ARIA attribute is, or why you would use it, or why you should avoid it if you can use semantic markup, could someone give us a short background on what ARIA is and why we, in a case where we would want to use it?
I feel like I'm talking a lot. I could give just like a quick example. Tabs would be an example, or even a main navigation. So being able to let somebody know that something's expanded or collapsed would be a good example of, or that there is a subnav. Those would be good examples of using ARIA.
So a way to communicate with the end user when the semantic markup doesn't accurately describe what might be happening on the screen through maybe a series of interactions or hidden content like tabs or accordions.
Exactly. And it's used almost exclusively by screen reader users. It's used by other users as well. I'd say a case where it's used too much is like if somebody wants to make a div into a button and they do ARIA, the role equals button, or stuff like that. Those are cases where people just
or like
just
a role.
Yeah.
A role equals button. Yeah. Buttons and links are not the same thing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that for a second, actually, because I learned about this as we were preparing for the Q&A today. I self-declared back-end developer, knew just enough front end to make front-end developers tell me to get back in the back end. So when it came to putting this markup together, a link, so an anchor, an A tag with an href value versus a button element that has a closing element or a closing piece to it, when would you use one versus the other? What's the right way?
So this is a good rule of thumb to remember if you're not sure if you should use a button or a link. If you are linking to another page, or if it's an anchor that's linking to a different part on the page, you will use a link because you have the href there that will bring you to a different page. Use a button if you're trying to do something like submit a form or something else like that. You're not actually linking to something else. You're just using the button to submit the button element, the HTML button element. So yeah, if you're looking to use a button, you use that button element. You don't use the link because your button is not directing you to a different page.
Yeah, I always use buttons for actions that occur on the same page, or like submitting a form, like Aubrey said. And I always get like nervous when I see anchor tags that for the href attribute is just like the hash symbol, because it means they're using that anchor tag to do something else on the page and not act like an actual like semantic link. That's when I start to sweat a little bit. I'm like, oh, what's going on?
That's a good rule of thumb there to look for, because I'm definitely guilty of that before. The href equals hash to do something there. So that's a great way you could easily scan the source code of your pages to see, are we doing this the best way possible? If you happen to find some of that, consider replacing those anchors with buttons.
Yep.
And yeah, so in the chat, as I see coming through here, John was asking button or input type equals submit. Ooh, that's a great question, John. Do you use the button element or the input element with type equals submit?
Yeah, for forms in Drupal, they're almost always inputs of type submit, and that's fine. And for buttons, like I tend to be using the actual button element for something like opening and closing a mobile menu. So you're not like a toggle, like the hamburger icon or something like that to open and close the mobile menu would be a place where I'd use a button.
I think they could be used interchangeably, but I wondered that too, what the difference was, but from what I've looked up, I think they could both be used interchangeably. If somebody else thinks something different in the chat, that'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the only time I use input type equals submit is in Drupal, because I don't know if it's still open, but I know there was an issue. I remember looking at this issue a few years ago, wanting to update all the input elements to use the button element. It's easier to style, like if you want to put like an SVG in the button or anything like that. That's a lot easier to do with that than to use the input element. So that's a big reason why to usually use button instead, but both technically work.
Mm-hmm. And Andy comments on it as well. The button element, because it does have a closing bracket to it, a closing tag, allows you to put other elements inside of it, where inputs are only the string that you get in the value attribute. So there's another case for using one over the other.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. It would actually be amazing if all the inputs in Drupal were switched over to buttons. That would be like a front-end developer's dream come true.
Yep.
It's just so much easier to style. There's always like icon heavy designs that we're having to deal with, and it's just so much easier with buttons.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. I can imagine that. Yeah, if you wanted to use a custom image as the submit button or as the submit indicator, doing that through a button would be a lot easier than trying to restyle a form. That was always my least favorite, restyling forms.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Let's see, I have a few other notes here actually that I wanted to ask about when it comes to using semantic elements in semantic HTML in your page instead of just divs and ARIA roles and such. And we've talked about a couple of really tricky pieces when it comes to accessibility. And I think another one is now with media. How do you make videos accessible to people when they combine visual and auditory components?
The key is, the biggest thing you could do is add captions to your videos. I mean, that's, the easiest thing. The number one way that people are adding videos would be YouTube. So what I would do, let's just stick with that. If you're making a YouTube video, YouTube creates captions, can create captions automatically. And then they create a transcript from the captions, which is the other requirement. So there's captions, closed captions, and then there's the transcript. So what you'll do is just let that happen, and then you'll go through your video and you want to make it synchronized. So you want to go in and you want to edit the captions to make sure that the captions are first accurate. So they have the right words and the right emphasis. And when there's empty space in it, that it describes what's going on. If there is something that's going on that the person that's using the caption needs to know, maybe there's music. Then you'll also make sure that it's actually lined up with what's going on. So sometimes captions, you'll notice, are not lined up with what's actually going on when the person's speaking. So you can actually edit that and then publish that and on YouTube. That would be a great way to do that. That's how we do it. Like at my group Alley Talks, we do that with our captions, and it's really important to do that. There's also a thing called an audio description that's also important. So you can also add those to your videos. So
yeah, so John's asking. Oh yeah, I was just going to read that one. John was asking, what's the difference between captions, transcripts, and subtitles? It's a great question.
So captions and subtitles are pretty much the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Transcript is a list. It's like just a list of what happened and the time. So, hi, my name is Kat, 101 on, PM, and then what I said next, 103, and it'll just have a list of what I said and a timestamp of what I said. But the captions is going to just appear on the screen. Usually people can edit how big or small they are, and that's basically it. So.
Yeah, you usually see captions while you're watching a video, and you'll read the transcript maybe after the fact if you want to go back and see what was said. And you can see transcripts. A lot of podcasts will also have transcripts, so just audio only. So that's always very useful to have too. And I think all podcasts especially need to have transcripts. and a lot of them don't, and that makes me sad.
Yeah, and you get a double whammy with that by having the transcript, basically the text version of the video or audio on your page, that can be indexed by a search engine. So better content for your site to be picked up as well. I think I'm pretty sure all of Lullabot's podcasts have transcriptions now to go with them. We did that years ago. We were using a tool called rev.com where they would have live, I think they actually introduced machine transcription for a smaller fee, which those never really had great results. I don't know if they've gotten better since, but they do have live people that they pay to transcribe those as well. So for a small fee, you can get somebody to transcribe your video or your audio for you, and they'll provide the whole caption or the transcription file that you can just copy and paste into your website or link to it.
And another thing we're talking about pre-recorded transcripts, and captions, but there's also live captions, right? So if you have a live event like DrupalCon, and let's say you're putting that out live on the internet, then you have to add live captions, and that's way harder. I mean, you have to get somebody that's willing to type while the person's speaking and try to be accurate and try to do it as quickly as possible, and so getting somebody that's really good at that is really important, but then also editing that after the fact to make sure that it's accurate is good. There's some interesting tools out there that we could share maybe later that try to do it. There's one that I saw that tries to automate it for you. I'll have to find it. But yeah, that's another thing to consider too.
Yeah, there was another thing that I thought of with videos. This is a little bit trickier maybe, but making sure that any video content on your site is not flashy, because you can actually trigger seizures with people who have seizure disorders if you're not careful. And I did come across a tool that scanned videos and checked them. I think they gave them like some sort of score for like how likely it might be to cause that to happen with people. I don't have the link on hand right now, but I can find it. And there may even be more than that one tool now available.
Is that the Pete tool?
I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. It was created at a university. I'm having a hard time. I think it was like a couple years ago when I saw it, but and then the other thing is if you embed a YouTube video in your site, this is kind of like not like a non-issue, but making sure people have the ability to stop a video if it's playing. You got to be able to, or animations also on your site. It's better to give them control so they can stop it if it's distracting or if it's getting in the way of their experience otherwise.
Yep.
Yeah, very good points. Go ahead,
that's something we see all the time, right, Aubrey and Pauline?
Yep.
Like when we go to either audit a site or redo a site or whatever, I mean, you see those big background videos and they don't have anything to stop them, and they just play. Yeah, that's like a big no-no, especially on a higher ed site or a government site. It's like, no, you're not supposed to do that. So, or slideshows that keep going.
Yeah,
and they have no way to pause them.
Yep.
So these actually bring up an interesting topic for me. We've talked about, I think, some of the most common types of accessibility enhancements that we put into sites, the alt text, or kind of looking at people who might have a sight impairment where they can't see the screen well or at all, or a hearing impairment, they can't hear any audio that comes with it. But it goes well beyond that. And I don't know if everyone might realize just the entire scope of accessibility that we're actually developing for. So could we talk about that for a minute? What are we talking about when we say accessibility? How far does this go?
So far.
Yeah.
Extremely far.
So what are the ones that people tend to not think about? We think about, we need alt text so that a screen reader can describe our image to somebody, or captions on a video. But Pauline, you brought up an excellent example, having your videos be scanned to know if they have a lot of flashiness to them or if they're distracting. That's a different type of accessibility that we're aiming towards. What are we looking at in that realm?
Yeah, well, I think one big one that we talked about when we were talking before before this all happened was cognitive issues, and that can be especially difficult to develop and create content for, because it's such a broad spectrum of what people might be having difficulty with. But yeah, cognitive seizure disorders, I mean, it ranges from physical issues to cognitive issues. I mean, it's just huge, and that's why accessibility is such a massively important topic, and why there are people who just specialize in it, because there's just so much to know.
Aubrey or Kat, do you have any other examples or situations where you've built some things in to handle maybe not what we think as traditional accessibility enhancements?
I think one thing that I've seen some of, and it's not really in the realm of development, but it's making sure that, and this kind of goes with the alt text thing you were talking about earlier, but making sure the content on your site is easily readable by a lot of people, like making sure you're using language that is easy for a lot of people to read. That's one that I've heard of a little bit. So yeah, that's another one that might not be as common as thinking of contrast issues or alt text or things like that. So yeah, that's another one.
Yeah, and that has completely to do, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
I keep muting myself. That has to do with the cognitive disability, totally. I mean, just writing in plain language, not complicating things and adding legalese to your site, keeping things simple, writing with bullets, organizing things properly, really just simplifying things is really important. I mean, cognitive disability is the #1 disability. So you really got to think about that. And, also like me, I'm on a site, it's really hard for me to read a big blob of text, but when it's organized properly, it's much easier for me to read that. So you got to think about that. People just are able to get that information better. So it just makes for a better site. Obviously, we talk a lot about visual disabilities when we talk about accessibility. So, but people just automatically think, oh, blind users. But there's also people with low vision. I mean, I wear glasses, and I'm getting older, and my eyesight's getting a little bit worse, and that's just how it is. And you got to think about your font not being 12, pixels. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Not, have a good font size. Make it a readable font. Doesn't need to be super stylish. Make it clear. Make sure that when people zoom in and out, that it doesn't mess with the site and overlap things and go everywhere. I mean, that's why the criteria are there. If you just follow them, you'll be good. The WCAG criteria, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You also have deaf and hard of hearing users is another group. So when you have like audio content that you post, make sure again that there's transcripts of the audio so that they can have an alternative method of getting that information. You have, mental health conditions. You have people with maybe missing limbs. So don't make everything dependent on a mouse. That's why you do keyboard testing to make sure that everything can be accessible by a keyboard. And that also helps screen reader users. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of disabilities, people have more than one. There's a combination. So, yeah.
That's an interesting topic as well. We are thinking of it sort of myopically, one thing or the other, but if you have multiple, making the site work in all of those realms. I mean, I sympathize with you about the getting older and not being able to see things as well. I realize now that I am command plussing just about everything that I go to bump the font size up so I can read it without squinting down at the screen. But that's a really easy one to overlook, I think, is especially, and I want to talk about, I've got a few topics here that I still want to go through. If there are questions about these, we still have the Q&A open, dump them in there. If you've stumbled upon a tricky problem, let's hear it and let's see if we can solve it. But yeah, having everything zoomed in, and then the designs tend to break. And this is a really tricky piece that we're starting to talk more about in development in general. In fact, Jen Witkowski and Mike Herschel gave a presentation in DrupalCon about designers and developers working with each other to create the right designs for a site. And I think part of that is what happens if your user command pluses to increase the font size, to zoom in, or vice versa. Do the designs hold up? Have we considered that in development of this site? And I'm reading through comments as we go here. As you age, multiple disabilities, comorbidities become more common than just having one. Yes, there's a lot to think about on those realms. So I'll ask that question first about the crossing teams and working together to help your design team be more attentive to those accessibility issues from a developer standpoint. Do any of you have experience kind of crossing the wall, so to speak, and working together to make sure that those things are addressed? I see heads nodding. I'm gonna ask Pauline first.
Yes. I've definitely gotten to experience that. Working with accessibility-minded designers definitely makes my job as a developer easier. But I mean, just leaving the lines of communication open, if we're developing something from a design that we've been given a design comp, and something comes up and it's like, this isn't quite working correctly, or these colors contrast is not going to work, or this font size is too small, going back to them and saying, okay, hey, here's what we can do, and here's another thing we can do, and just having those open lines of communication and working together can be helpful. I mean, we're all in it together to help make the best, most accessible websites that we can.
Yeah, I've worked with a couple designers, both Lullabot designers and designers at other companies. And yeah, I like having fostering collaboration with your designers is definitely key. Where if both designer and developer are open to any kind of feedback about this kind of thing, it's great. Issues that I've seen in the past have been issues with font sizes and issues with color contrast. I know like some places will actually have a style guide where they have the contrast they actually have like color combinations that are approved that you can use. Like here, if you use this color background, you have to use this color text and things like that. And that makes it really easy when we are working with a designer, especially to say, hey, these are the two colors that you can use here. Or if you're using this background, use this text color. So yeah, I mean, the main name of the game is having the open communication between designers and developers. And that's definitely, like Pauline said, made my life easier as a developer.
Kat, do you have any examples of good or bad of trying to work with designers to make the site accessible?
Yeah, I've had both. So pre-Lullabot, especially long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I had some really bad experiences with it. And it definitely was difficult, especially when you get like a desktop design and that's all you get. And as a developer, you are the one that has to come up with how it's going to break down in mobile and tablet and all of the different in-betweens. And then when you do, the designer and everybody else doesn't like it, and they're upset because it ruined their design. So those are the hard times, the ones where you want to cry. The good times are when you're at Lullabot and you have a great team of designers who are just so open to accessibility. And it's like I'm pitching for Lullabot. I'm not joking. The team that we have with Jared and Jen and Anna and Sydney, and forgive me if I'm forgetting anybody, are just amazing people. Christina, she's also kind of works within that team too. Amazing at giving us designs that have accessibility in mind at the beginning, They have all of the different breakpoints for every design. And they always ask questions. So if they're not sure about something, they'll ping us, they'll reach out to us, and they will ask a question about something, and we'll just collaborate and communicate and work on it and figure out a good solution. So that's the best. That's what you want in a team. You know, you want to have your design team work on it from the very beginning, because as a developer, that's going to really help. Also, annotated designs from a developer's perspective is very, very important too, so that you know what the designer meant, and so you know how to build it out. So.
Yep.
And you said there, this is the ideal situation. This is what you want to have, is to have your designers be open and work together to come up with the best solution. But there's times where you actually absolutely need to have that. There are legal requirements around a lot of this, especially if you're working in certain realms. And I feel like at least I hope we're getting to a point where those people who work in those realms are more aware that they need to be doing this, but I know that's not always the case. So what sort of ramifications are there for not making your site inaccessible, other than the fact that it's inaccessible from more of a legal standpoint? And there's always that pushback too. There's inevitably going to be a stakeholder, a client somewhere, who says, we don't want to put in the extra time or the extra money to go through all this extra work. Just make it do what I told you to make it do. So when we have those types of tough stakeholders and these requirements by certain agencies, how do we handle those, or what sort of experiences can you talk to us about that? I know, Pauline, you used to work in that realm a lot.
Yeah. For .gov sites, and that's just federal sites in the United States. At least to my knowledge, it's different in other countries, I'm sure, but we have Section 508 of the American Disabilities Act, which outlines the requirements for having your website be accessible. And .gov sites are regularly audited, and they generally have to score above a certain threshold in order to be considered compliant. And the ramifications of not being compliant are, I mean, not only are you alienating a large percentage of the population, but you can also be sued. You can be taken to court, and the lawsuits are very, very expensive. And a lot of the times, the people win, to my knowledge, because this is outlined in the law. For sites that aren't covered necessarily by that, they can still be sued. They can still be taken to court for not having an accessible site. And it's that could be a motivating factor for getting people on board with accessibility. If you spend the money up front, it can save you money in the future. But there's also the humanity side of it, and the empathy side. So, I would say everyone on the planet knows someone with a disability. And if you can, take a moment to think about how difficult it might be for that person or multiple people that to navigate your site, to order their prescriptions online, to, get other medical supplies that they need, or anything at all, or groceries, that can, I would like to think that would be a motivating factor for people as well.
Kat, Aubrey, anything else you'd want to add to that when it comes to other, legal reasons, or the requirements and where you would discover those? I know we've mentioned the WCAG and 503 compliance of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act.
508.
It's 508.
I'm sorry, 508.
Okay.
503, access denied.
Yeah, I'm reading an article. It says that there was a 14.3 increase from 2020 to 2021 in accessibility lawsuits, web accessibility lawsuits.
Oh, wow.
So I don't even know about 2022 yet. And that's on bola.org. So I could share that link. Just like Pauline was saying, working in local government gave me a big education in that. So I think a lot of people don't realize they're covered, or that they're, I shouldn't say covered, they are responsible under Section 508 because they think, oh, I'm not a local government. But when you get any money from the federal government, you are going to be you're going to be under the Section 508. So if you get grants at all, if you get any money from the federal government, that's it. You are going to need to make your site accessible, and you can get sued under that. Secondly, when it comes to ADA, there's plenty of private companies that have gotten sued under the ADA specifically and have lost, that I wouldn't, if I had a big private company, wouldn't want to risk that. You know, look at Domino's, look at Target. I mean, when Dixie, I think, lost, I mean, there's countless examples. But I put this analogy to somebody, and I actually think it's a pretty good one. This is, you know, if I have a business and I have a newer business, let's just say that, and I'm building it and building the building, and I decide to put steps in front of it, and I'm like, you know, I just want those steps. And other people are like, you should really have a ramp so people with disabilities can get into this building. And you're like, no, I really just want steps because it's prettier. You know, that would go against the law, and you'd get in trouble because that's against ADA when you're giving services to the public. I see it as the same thing. When you have a website and you're giving services to the public, that's not fair for you to go and give services to the public and then say, sorry, can't use the steps, you can't come in. That's pretty much the same thing you're doing to people with various disabilities when you're blocking them from using your services. So build the dang ramp. That's all I got to say. It's not that hard.
Build the dang ramp. If we had a tagline, there you go.
Yeah.
Aubrey, anything to add?
I don't think so. I think both Kat and Pauline covered what I was going to say. So sweet. All
right. We have a few minutes left, and with those few minutes, I would actually like to talk a little bit about the how. We've talked a lot about the why. I think that's pretty obvious for us, and the what. But I think that's one of the big things that I used to hear getting pushed back on was we don't have the extra money or time to do all this extra work. And really, these should be things that we do as developers as part of our habit, as just part of our development practice. They shouldn't be afterthoughts, but it's not always easy to know if you're doing it right. So there's some tooling out there that's just getting better and better as time goes by to help people understand why and the what that they need to fix. So what are some of the tools that you use when you're developing a website that are kind of just standard go-to to make sure that you haven't missed anything, that you're doing the right contrast ratios in your colors, that sort of thing?
Well, a lot of browsers now have kind of built-in contrast checkers, but I also know there are other apps you can use or other plugins for your browsers. I know Kat has a bunch of those in her Lullabot article that were linked before. Another one are some of the browser add-ons I use the Wave tool, the WebAIM, I think it's WebAIM Wave tool. That one will tell you if there's any contrast issues. That one will tell you if you have like the document outline is out of order. That's another one. That's another accessibility issue I'll see sometimes is there might not be an H1 on the page, or it might go from an H3 to an H2 when it should be the other way around. So I use that tool. I'll use the Axe tool. It's DQ's web accessibility tool to also kind of detect some of those other same things. So I'll run both of those. I'll usually tab through the site, not use a mouse, make sure I can get to everything using the keyboard. I'll sometimes use VoiceOver, go through it with a screen reader to make sure things sound correct. Those are just the few of the ones that I use. And I know Kat and Pauline probably have some more examples. So I'll let them talk about their favorites.
Kat, which ones do you go to? A lot of the ones she just mentioned, I definitely use VoiceOver for the screen reader because I have a Mac. Accessibility Insights is pretty good. That's another yeah, automated plus manual mixed in. Arc Toolkit is the one that's in the dev tools that's pretty good and quick. Axe Dev Tools has a pro version. I'm not going to pay for it, but it's actually really cool for manual accessibility testing. And there's one called Colorblindly. And these are all Chrome extensions. Colorblindly is really cool because it'll show you how your site looks with different kinds of color blindness. So I use that quite a bit. And that's actually really great when you want to demo how something looks to your stakeholders or maybe even design team or something, just to show gray on gray is not great. There is Font Finder is a great one when you want to make sure that the fonts is the correct font and it looks good and the settings are right. High contrast is another one. You want to check to make sure that things are working and can flip when people adjust their contrast. So those are the visual disabilities we were talking about. People sometimes have settings on their browser that make things more readable. Like for instance, I use dark mode, and there's a lot of sites that don't have their dark mode settings set up properly. And then there's the color contrast checker, lots of those that you can use. So
yeah, Firefox actually has some colorblind stuff built into it. They have an accessibility tool. I don't feel like a lot of the Firefox accessibility built-in things are great, but I think the colorblind simulator is good in there. So if you use Firefox, that's a good example or good
Chrome,
good to use.
And Chrome itself has a lot of great in just its dev tools too, also. So I think any browser has great stuff just within their dev tools.
Yep.
So.
Anything in your arsenal, Pauline, that wasn't covered already that you like to go to?
No, that covered everything. Yeah, great answer, everybody. I think the only thing I would add is just if you are using an automated accessibility checker, you are going to end up having to probably still check some things manually. Like they won't necessarily tell you that your image alt text is great. They won't always catch everything that like a human user would be able to catch. So it's just a side note. We have great tools, but they're not perfect.
Yep, and that's a great note to end on. I'm going to reiterate that, and somebody else mentioned it earlier. Doing it yourself. Grab a bandana or blindfold yourself and see if you can navigate your own website using the keyboard and figure out where you're going. Turn off all your audio and play a video and see if you can still follow along, or you could get the transcription with it. And if we had some time, we were actually going to try and show people how VoiceOver on a Mac works, because it's dead simple. You've got a built-in screen reader on your Mac if you're using a Mac. And so if people aren't aware of this, maybe Kat, how do you enable VoiceOver? Give us a quick step-by-step of how you would use VoiceOver to read your site.
If you have a Mac, you go on the very top, there is a circle with a person with their arms spread out and their legs like this, and you just click on it and it says enable VoiceOver, and then that's it. That's all you do. Or you go into your system preferences and you click on accessibility, and then it has VoiceOver, and then you enable VoiceOver. It's as simple as that. You can also speed up and slow down the voice. For Windows users, there's a screen reader called NVDA that's free that you can download and use. I believe Windows also has a built-in one called Narrator. So
there you go. You really can't beat first-person testing, live human.
Yep, absolutely. You got to do the manual with the automated, and also they overlap. So yeah, absolutely. Another one, by the way, I wanted to mention was within the dev tools is drawing a blank. Oh, forget it. Lighthouse, my bad. Lighthouse.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And it has the manual testing suggestions. That's great too.
Yep.
Yep. And that is one we are currently working on, if it's not already into our Tugboat QA tool. So we're going to start building a lot of those into these tools that we're using to preview sites as well. So yes, lots of great stuff. And I know we mentioned a lot of tools there, a lot of links, and thank you to the people who have been sharing those in the chat as well. And of course, if you have any questions about anything we talked about here or topics we didn't cover, or you'd like references to some of those tools, you can find those at lullabot.com. We have a lot of content that we post about when it comes to all things accessibility, including lists of tools and resources. You can also reach out to us on Twitter at Lullabot. We love to talk to you about all of those things. And I think with that, we are 2 minutes over time. So thank you to everybody who has been asking questions, who has participated in the chat, helping to answer those questions. And one last piece Robert wants to throw in there: to start or stop the Windows narrator, it's as simple as Control Windows key Enter. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah.
And thank you all. And thanks to our panelists for answering our questions today and taking us through the world of accessibility. It's a very important topic. We appreciate you. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Happy GAD Day.